My name is Nathan Hawk. On October 29th of 1823, I have 4 siblings, 3 sisters and a baby brother, and we were raised down on the farm, sunrise to sundown. There was nothing exciting going on in our lives while we were growing up. Let me tell you about a couple years later in my life that were a little more eventful. In 1846, my father came to me and told me that there were 5 soldiers showed up at Mount Pisgah, Iowa, looking for recruits. Now, they were sent by the President of the United States, James K. Polk, and the United States government, looking for 500 men between the ages of 18 and 45 to help fight in the Mexican War. Now, our townsfolk were afraid of the Army and suspicious of the government because they had been forced from their homes in New York, in Ohio, and again in Illinois because of their religious beliefs as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Nevertheless, our leader, Brigham Young, gathered us together and said, this might be an opportunity for the salvation of Israel. So we set aside our concerns, we faithfully did our duty, and we joined the Army of the West. Now, I was 23 years old when myself and my father and my cousin Silas, we marched from Mount Pisgah, Iowa, down to the mustering grounds at Council Bluffs, Iowa. And it's there that we enlisted as privates in the United States Army Infantry Division, Mormon Battalion, Company B. And the Mormon Battalion was entirely consistent of members of our church. 496 men, accompanied by, there were 44 children, and 31 women who washed our clothes and cooked our meals, and they tended to the sick. There were many. We marched from Council Bluff, Iowa to Fort Leavenworth, and the going was tough. It took its toll on us, both body and soul. We regrouped at Fort Leavenworth, and the Army issued the men flintlock muskets and a white leather belt with a shoulder strap. We got those brass U.S. buckles and a black leather ammunition pouch. We got a canteen and a bayonet. And the Army also gave us an allowance with which to purchase military uniforms. But we all decided to send that money back to our families instead. So in the heat of August of 1846, with our Army provisions and our own clothing on our backs, we headed from Fort Leavenworth to Santa Fe. And within a week, we were just as ragtag and raggedy looking as when we first arrived at Fort Leavenworth. We marched through the Kansas territory, the Oklahoma territory, down into the Colorado territory. By the time we reached Santa Fe, our numbers were so depleted because of fatigue and sickness. We were down more than 100 men with only there were 4 children and only 1 woman remaining with us. I missed my family very much, but I thank God I'd left them behind. It was rough going. Now, beyond Santa Fe, there was no trail at all. No trail that would accommodate a wagon, barely a route that would accommodate a mule. It was our arduous task to build a road through that impassable terrain that wagons and supplies could travel later. And we succeeded. On January 29th of 1847, the remaining 355 men and 1 woman marched into San Diego, California, only to find out that the war was already over. A treaty had been signed and we were mustered out of the military, although they did let us keep our muskets. So many of us decided to travel north. We went up to San Francisco with the idea of working through the winter doing odd jobs. But then in January of 1848, gold was discovered at James Marshall's sawmill that he was building for John Sutter, and that started a real rumpus. Now, going backwards, there was a man named Samuel Brannan. He was a prominent member of our church, and way back in February of 1846, he, with 238 other members of our church, set sail from New York aboard the ship Brooklyn. They sailed down around the Horn of of South America, and on July 31st of 1846, they sailed through California's Golden Gate. Now his hope was to establish a settlement in the Mexican territory away from the challenges of the United States government. But when he got here, to his dismay, the U.S. military had already taken control of California. But Samuel Brannan was an industrious man. He had brought with him on board ship a printing press and a supply of paper. He became the owner and editor of San Francisco's first newspaper, the California Star. Now back to spring of 1848, just months after gold discovery. Many of the merchants in San Francisco were disheartened because of sagging and lagging business, slow sales, and they weren't making any money. So they solicited Samuel Brannan's newspaper to come up with a special edition printing of 2,000 copies headlining the California gold discovery. And their intent was to spread the news far and wide and entice people to come to California. Now, Samuel Brannan thought that was a great idea. He happily obliged. He printed the 2,000 copies, he set some aside, and he hired me as a mounted dispatch courier, along with my father and my cousin Silas Harris. There was a man named Sanford Jacobs, another man named Richard Slater. There were 5 other men whose names I don't remember, 10 of us in all. We boarded a boat in San Francisco. We sailed up the river. 15 days later, we got to Sutter's Fort, and there we mounted up on horseback with satchels of mail and bundles of newspaper, and off we went. We were known as the riders of the California Star Express. Now, two important things were going on here. This was the first newspaper to ever leave California, News of California leaving California. And secondly, this was the first mail dispatch under contract to leave California. So Californians were writing to their families back east. Samuel Brannan himself mounted a horse and rode all the way out to the foothills with us to give us a proper send-off on this historic endeavor. But he stopped while we continued on. It took us 23 days to travel the first 40 miles. The dangerous Truckee River was swift and rocky bottomed. We faced challenges with severe weather, cold temperatures, rugged terrain, multiple river crossings, and then the open desert. When we got to Salt Lake City, we took the news to Brigham Young. En route, we met every overland wagon that we could find and divert them to California instead of going to Oregon. And thereafter, we continued our ride back east toward Missouri. One of the copies of the California Star ended up at the New York Herald. And they did what they did best. They rewrote the story as a 2-column front page report, and they released it on August 19th of 1848, causing the biggest gold rush in history. Now, the California Gold Rush was also the driving force of what became known as Manifest Destiny. And ironically, the California Gold Rush also put Samuel Brannan's newspaper out of business. It brought people to California as intended, as desired, but the population of San Francisco plummeted dramatically. Samuel Brannan's entire newspaper staff, along with countless citizens and residents of San Francisco, they abandoned ships and homes and businesses to go running out into the foothills to seek gold on their own. And in the fallout, Samuel Brannan's newspaper closed on June 14th of 1848. Now, I met up with my wife, and we decided, my wife Elizabeth, we decided that we would return to the West. So we decided not to stop and settle in Salt Lake City. We contracted with a group of 80 other immigrant wagons, and we continued on to California. After 5 months of trail travel, we made it safely there. But en route, crossing the Humboldt Sink, our third child was born in the back of our wagon. We named him William Humboldt Hawk. And William bragged for the rest of his life that he was the first native son of California ago, we constantly reminded him that the Humboldt Sink was actually in what's now called Nevada. We did eventually make it to the banks of the Sacramento River. We rested and recuperated there for about 2 weeks, and the wagon train split up in all kinds of directions off, on their own adventures from there. My wife and I, we settled in a little place called Mormon Island on the American River. It's just a mile or two above the little town of Folsom. And it's there that we spent most of the rest of our lives raising our 6 children. There was our oldest is Samuel, and then Margaret, and then William. And then we had a daughter, Mary Ann. And then 3 sons. Our oldest, Lukens and John, are buried right here. And then we had a son, George. And Ella, our youngest, can't forget Ella, is buried here as well. Our oldest daughter, Margaret, and our youngest son, George, both passed away early in childhood. They were both near the age of 2. I died at the age of 87 on November 17th of 1910 at the Old Soldiers Home in Yountville, right here in Napa County. And I am buried here with my wife, my son Lukens, my son John, and my daughter Ella. If you're bound for Heaven's Gate, you'll hear the choir of angels. If you're bound for somewhere else, it's brimstone, fire, and banjos. I'm Nathan Hawk, and that's my story. I appreciate you coming to listen today, and to tolerate my banjo playing. Now you go out and make history.